So let's first talk about HTML, and HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's all you're doing. You're marking up text so that the browser can render it properly, the browser can interpret it. And the hypertext part of it means that the text is hyper, that you can create links within it. And this started back in the early days of the web when Tim Berners-Lee was creating the web in the late 80s, early 90s, created this easy markup language so that it would be accessible for anyone who wanted to create content. So you wrap the tags around the text, and it provides the context. It provides the structure for the content, but it has really nothing to do with how the content looks. Now, browsers have defaults so that if you use HTML, that it will render your paragraph a certain way or your headings a certain way. These are the defaults. But we will get into styling those to your own preferences so you're not relying on the defaults. And some of the basic elements that you'll see, and notice the structure, the elements, and sometimes they're called tags. The elements are surrounded by these angle brackets, opening and closing. And so you'll have things like HTML. The HTML page has two sections, a head and a body section. So your content goes in the body and information about the page goes in the head. And then the kinds of elements you might see in the body are paragraphs, headings, images, and then the A tag, it stands for anchor, but that's how you create links. And all of these tags have opening and closing tags. So I'll show you how those work as we get to actual code. And some of them have attributes, which we'll cover in a second, which are options within the tags. Sometimes you have nested elements. So instead of just surrounding text, you are actually having 2 or 3 layers of elements that surround text to be able to create things like lists. So lists can be either unordered lists, UL, or ordered lists, OL. The ordered lists have numbers next to the items. The unordered lists are bulleted. And here you can see what I was talking about, the closing tags. So I've opened the UL and I've closed it here with the slash, and I'm sure you've all seen this syntax before. And then each list item is surrounded by a LI with an opening and closing LI. So those are just 2 items, they would be a bulleted list, and it's nested within the UL. And tables are similar, except there are 3 things that you nest. You have a table, you have a table row, and then each row has table data. So this would have cell 1 and cell 2 right next to each other within one row on a table. It gets more complex than that as you start designing larger tables with different kinds of styling on it, but this is basically how it works. Tables with rows, and then the cells make up the columns within that row. And as we get more into CSS, there are these layout elements, these generic tags that allow us to create sections on the page. So div is one of those that allows us to create sections on the page. It's a block element that creates a new block every time you create one. And then there's also a generic element called span. This does not create a new block when you create it, so it can be used within another element. And that is not necessarily used for layout, but it's often used in scripting when you're trying to manipulate something on the page, which we will get to in the JavaScript segment. And then as you start talking about doing interactive things on the web, the last part of HTML that you have to really discuss is forms. Because you have to be able to create a form to get the user to input something before you can actually have much interactivity on a page. So there's a form element, again, a series of nested tags elements. The element for a text input is the type equals text, and you just include that. I've given it an ID here because when I use it in the script later, I need to be able to identify it. And then the same thing here is a drop-down. This is the code, the HTML code to create a drop-down. It's a nested set of elements where we have the select opening and closing, and then for each car, I have an option. And I can give it any sort of value I want here, depending on what I want to be sent when the user submits the form. And again, it has an ID, so that this gets sent in a unique way, and I can manipulate the page knowing which car was selected. This will make a lot more sense as we start working with it. It's not as complicated as it looks here. So I mentioned before that some elements have attributes, and these are just options within certain elements. And so there are many different resources online that you can go to that would explain which elements have which attributes. And so, for example, in the first one, we have the A for anchor, which creates the link, but you can't actually link to something unless you know what the URL is, what the address is. So the href stands for horizontal reference, and you put in the name, the URL of the page, the address of the page. So this is an external link that would go out to google.com. And quite often when I'm using external links, I require students to have them go to a blank or a new window. So that target equal underscore blank does that. And then notice here that the text between the opening A, so this whole thing is the opening A tag that has two attributes, href and target, that have value. So it's attribute equal value. And you can chain them within one element just by putting a space between them. So attribute equal value, attribute equal value. Here is the closing angle bracket for the opening A element. And then here's the text that would show up on the page. So the word Google would show up on the page underlined as a link, but it would go to google.com. And then you have to include the /A to close the tag, otherwise everything on your page would be underlined. And if you've ever worked on the web, you've probably had that sort of error come up and had to troubleshoot because maybe you incorrectly closed your tag. Same thing with image. IMG requires a source. There's no way for the browser to know which image you're talking about unless you give it a source. So it's going to be source equal and then some sort of a file name. And if that file is not in the same folder as the page that you're working on, the HTML page that you're working on, then you need to give it a path of the folder that it is in. If it is in the same folder, then you don't have to worry about that. And notice here that the IMG element is a little different than other elements that we use that have an opening and a closing element. Because we're not surrounding any text, we're actually just providing the source of an image. The IMG element is called a standalone, or what they call a void element. And I have put a slash here because I am used to doing that from a former version of HTML. But the slash here is actually optional. So you could remove this slash and just have the tag, the IMG element standalone right here with the source in it, and it does not have a /IMG that goes with that. IDs and classes, we'll actually get to using that a little bit more when we do styling as well as doing the manipulation with JavaScript. IDs are special types of attributes that you can give to an element, and you can name them anything you want so that you can create your own IDs and classes. IDs are used once on a page, and classes may be used multiple times. IDs are great for being used once on a page, so if you have a header section on your site where you want to put the logo or your navigation, you can say ID equal header. But if you have several paragraphs that occasionally you want it to be read, maybe you have like a couple of callouts on the page that are a couple of paragraphs that need to be read, you could say class equal read and create a style for that that would handle all the things associated with a read paragraph. But you can do that with any sort of name, so you can name it anything you wanted. I could have said class equals special if I wanted to call it a special paragraph, especially if I had multiple things that I wanted to do to it. Maybe I wanted it to be red and bold and a different font. And then really the last HTML element you need to be concerned with is comments. And comments are used to remove the text from the code. So it'll be in the code, but it doesn't render in the browser. The browser just doesn't see it when it is a comment. And quite often, every programming language has comments because you usually like to leave site instructions, like indicating what sections of the code you're on, or explaining something that you've done so that a coder that comes after you to look at this code, quite often coders work in teams, or somebody in the future who's looking at your code will kind of know what you've done. And another reason for comments, and you see this in all languages, but everybody uses them for testing, because if something doesn't work, instead of deleting it and trying to figure out what's wrong with it, sometimes you just comment it out. You'll hear that phrase, commented out. So you write HTML in some sort of an HTML editor. It might be a text editor like TextEdit, or a more powerful HTML editor that has some additional features, something like brackets, Sublime Text, Atom, Notepad++. Quite often they're free or very inexpensive, and these HTML editors have color coding to help give you clues. It helps with troubleshooting. Sometimes the colors will tell you if something is wrong. They will help with indenting sometimes, as well as automatically closing tags for you. You can do it in any kind of a text editor. So if you're on a Mac, you can use TextEdit. And I have used TextEdit in teaching it for many years. And you can see this file here that I have. That is an HTML file. And this is the file that I used to create our PhDigital Bootcamp website. And you can see all the code in here. However, when you start TextEdit, there's some defaults you have to change in preferences. And you'll see here for a new document, if it says rich text, you have to change it to plain text. And you need to turn off all these smart things over here. And then in open and save, you just need to make sure that HTML files as HTML code instead of formatted text. You want no formatting. If the file comes up and it has like what looks like a little ruler with a bunch of numbers at the top, that means you're in rich text. So what you need to do is close the file that you're in, change those preferences that I just showed you, and then open a new file, and then you'll be in plain text mode. But what you're more likely to want to use is an HTML editor of some sort. So I'm using Brackets now, but over the years I've used Text Wrangler, which is now part of Notepad, and Sublime Text and Atom are all very good entries to be able to use, and most of the time you can get them for free. So look around and see what kind of a text editor you can use, but to goof around with what we're doing today for this lesson, you are welcome to use any kind of a text editor that you have on your computer. And so I should also say, when you make an HTML page, it needs to have a .html extension, and the home page is typically called index.html, and that's just the file that the browser uses as the default home page of the site. So if it sees a page, if it goes to a URL and you don't provide the name of the site or the name of a file for it, it looks for a file named index.html. And so that's why you can go to phdigitalbootcamp.com and it renders a page without telling it the name of the page. So if we switch over to the browser and take a look at, say, my personal site, you'll see cindyroyal.com, and this is an index page for cindyroyal.com. It's named index.html, but that is not showing up here yet in the URL. If I click on teaching, it's going to go to my teaching.html page. So that's why most home pages, all home pages, are named index.html. So here's some sample code from Brackets, and so you can take a look at this. You should recognize some of these tags. Some of these things are things that we've talked about, and some of them may still be a little bit confusing to you in terms of exactly what they're doing, but that's okay. You'll start to see things like, oh, here's the closing head tag, here's where the body is starting, here are some list items, and here's the div tags opening and closing in different ways on a page. So you'll start getting used to that. Another thing that you can do to get used to looking at HTML is I use Chrome because I like the tools that Chrome uses. But if I do a control click on the page, and you can do this in any browser, you can view the source. And there are other ways to view the source. There's usually ways up in the that you can view it from the menu up here. But you can see the code of any website here, and you can take a look at it. Sometimes you'll see what is actually very helpful, and other times it may be too confusing because the site is too complex. But in the early days of the web, this is mainly how I learned how to do it, as I just looked at other people's pages and started figuring out what was going on. So let's look at some example code. I've got a file up here in Brackets, and this is just a generic page that I'm going to provide most of this code for you so that you can work with it and fill it out yourself. And then we'll be applying some CSS to this. And I should point out that I have a website called CodeActually here, codeactually.com, that you can go to. And if you want to get some more experience with HTML under the basics, I have an HTML tag that you can go to, an HTML area. There's some additional videos that you can watch and lots of sample code that you can go through. And it tells you how it renders and goes into much more detail than I've been able to do in this lesson. But if we take a look at this code, we have the HTML opening and closing. And I've indicated some comments here. So those should not concern you, but you should be familiar that this is a comment. It's letting me know that I've ended my body tag or I've ended my HTML tag here. We've got the head opening and closing and a title in here, and the title tag opens and closes. And here's where my body opens. And within the body, I have an H1 and a list for my navigation. And that's a common way of doing navigation, then we style it later. We have a paragraph we've got an image, and that image has to exist somewhere in the same folder as this HTML page, just because I have it without a folder path here. And then I just have an H2, paragraph, another H2, a paragraph, another list. This list includes some links. And then down here, I have a table that has a fixed pixel width. Of course, we want to move to percents later to make things responsive, but for now, a fixed pixel width that you can play with. And then I just have 2 columns, and I have some elements within each of those columns and rows. And then I have a paragraph down here that says you can email me at, and this is an href that has a mail to. You may have seen those. I don't use those very frequently anymore because most people are using some sort of a web-based mail program and not a mail client. But I do like to make sure that anytime I use a mailing address, an email address, that I actually include the address on the screen so that the user can copy and paste it into their web-based mail program. Now there's also problems with spam, so you should have a spam filter. Sometimes people will, use the word at in some sort of brackets here to kind of trick some of the bots that are going around and trolling for people's emails. But generally you want to make it easy for somebody to be able to find you with the email address. So let me save this page right now, and I've for this case just named it test.html. And then I'm going to come over to the browser and open a new tab, and I'll say File, Open File. And I will find this page that I've been working on. And here it is. And so you'll see that Cindy's web page is here, and it has links. These pages don't exist yet. These are internal links that would go to a page called about.html. And you'll see the sections for introduction, education, hobbies. You see this list over here. Let's test to see if this link works. It does. It's one of those that opens in a new window. You should test everything that you have. And then we have a table down here that also has a series of links. Great, they all work. So you'll notice, however, that we have a broken image here, and you've probably seen this on the web. And so we need to troubleshoot that. We need to figure out what's going on. If we look in brackets, we know that the image name is supposed to be cr.jpg. And if we look in the folder, where I've got this stuff saved, I have a file called cindy.jpg, and that's not the same as cr.jpg. So I would either need to go find the file called cr.jpg or rename it here or re-reference it here. So why don't we do that? Let's go into the code and say, oh, we put the wrong name in here, and I'll change it to cindy.jpg. It's in the same folder as this now, and I have not indicated any additional folder path here. And so it should work. So if we go back to the browser and we refresh the page, we now have cindy.jpg showing up properly here. So there's much more that you can do with web design. We'll talk more about styling. Obviously, this picture was sized at this small size. There are ways to use attributes to make it smaller, but ideally you'd want to size it in Photoshop or another program first so that the file size was small and not taking up a lot of your bandwidth and taking time to load into the browser window page. So the next video will discuss CSS.